So, Patrick, what do you think about the reverse retro jerseys anyway?
I thought we were here to talk about Liverpool's inability to win at home.
No, we definitely don't want to talk about that. I'll be slamming the laptop shut in a hurry if that's the case. Look, this is another remarkable day in another remarkable season for the Vancouver Canucks. Probably their best game of the year without their star Elias Pettersson. Beat the best team in the North Division, Toronto
Yeah,
Maple Leafs. People,
sure.
oh, whipping boy Jake Virtanen has a great performance. Yada yada yada. Twitter warriors and all that other
Yeah.
garbage. Maybe clean up your own yard before you start pointing at other people, Jake. However, no one's talking about that today. Everyone's talking
Yeah.
about the press conference from GM Jim Benning. Your take on it?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Virtanen because I was thinking a bit about, sort of his approach and sort of him puffing out his chest. Hey, I scored 2 goals. It's like, great, Jake, where have you been the rest of the season? And there's a bit of kind of not really having your head focused on the big picture. And, I mean, Jim Benning, I think, in his way has his focus on the big picture, but it is stunning to think we're 7 years into this, and now he's saying they need 2 more years. And you go back all the way. You go back to Mike Gillis was fired partly because basically he thought they had to rebuild. Trevor Linden was fired because he partly thought they had to rebuild. They've made the playoffs twice in 7 years. It's almost impossible for them to make the playoffs this year. And sort of to say everything's well, we're just kind of humming along, everything's fine. We've got a plan. It's just such a hard thing to believe because you made a couple good draft picks. Like there's no denying that. There are a couple good prospects, but it's not like they're overflowing with them. And certainly the team that's in town right now is the easy comparison point because Brendan Shanahan went in for a rebuild, and they've made the playoffs 5 times in the 7 years that he's been in charge. And the idea of you have the old idea of you have to
Next,
understand
one
what we
more round
started
for
with.
the Leafs, though, Patrick.
Yeah, well, people aren't happy with me about that. But
Yeah.
the idea that the old you have to understand what we started with. Well, the Leafs were in a bad spot, and they've done fine. So at some point, it just becomes about not having a plan, and certainly I think the influence of ownership. I mean, I think you and I've talked a bit about this, and in the end, like Benny's doing the job, he's doing his job, like he's carrying forward, and he's still here, and I mean, he stood up and gave his answers. And at the end of the day, I really think it's also about who's employing him and their
Well,
decisions that they've made.
so let's talk about that then. You and I have talked about this a lot, but just so people don't understand, there's a theory out there that a lot of these contracts, whether it's Louis Erickson or Jay
Mhm.
Beagle or whoever else they've signed,
Tyler Byers.
A lot of pressure from management to do that, or from ownership to do that, because the fear of the rebuild is not. I don't want to say that that's not Jim Benning, but it appears to a lot of people that
Yeah.
ownership wants playoff revenue. Like in order to make that team viable within their other business structures, that they want to have that. So they don't want the complete burn it down for 5 years, then we're going to be great. It's we would like to get better while we're maybe around in the playoffs. Um, so then how much can you fault Jim Benning? I mean, he obviously has to go with a recommendation. I think this, like, you wouldn't go in and say, "Oh, this is terrible. We shouldn't do this," and ownership says, "Do it anyway," right? That's not the case. So they've wanted big fish in free agency in order to
Yeah.
get in the playoffs and sort of do this soft rebuild. It obviously hasn't worked. So who's more to blame?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's the person signing the checks. I think ownership carries a huge part of the blame here because they, in the end, are the ones who have set the strategy by picking the key management personnel. I mean, like I said, Mike Gillis was let go. I mean, Trevor Linden literally basically predicted that this was a necessary thing. I mean, as we understand it, when he was let go, he basically said, I think we need 2 more years of pain and then we're going to be pointed in the right direction. He arrived at that conclusion belatedly, which was essentially the argument that Gillis and his staff was making. So it took 4 years for Linden to realize what was, I think, a lot of people recognized was needed in 2014, perhaps even in 2013. And you sort of puttered along with this kind of half-baked dream of, well, we'll play some playoff games and everything will be fine. Like, no, it's not. You can't operate like that. You have to in sports. You have to operate about actually winning and aiming for the top. because that's what everybody's here for at the end of the day. And, sort of hoping and wishing that maybe things will work out. Maybe that worked once upon a time. I don't know, but certainly in the modern version of the game where money is everywhere, and there are also constraints on how you can spend your money in certain areas, certainly on personnel. You just can't go along on a wing and a prayer. You have to have a fully laid out plan. Here's where we're going to be. Here's what our team's going to look like, and not sort of constantly signing guys and hoping, well, we'll see how the team shakes out. There's been such a pattern of, well, let's get this guy or let's get that guy and let's figure it out, and not having a cohesive plan. Like, how does Tyler Myers actually make us better? Tyler Myers has been, last year he was fine. He hasn't been very good this year. And, what does his skill set come to the table that you don't already have? Like, what's the alternative to not signing him? And that too often has not been part of the consideration. And, again, you can go on other areas that I've been sort of talking about. You look at signing guys like Sam Gagner, who within a year you'd already decided you didn't want anymore. Like, how do you sign someone to a 3-year deal and then decide a year in you don't want him? Sven Baertschi, they re-signed to a 3-year deal, decided they didn't want him. It just goes on and on. Like, there's just been a series of these mistakes. A lot of that's on management, because in the end, management's asked to execute the plan. But it also, in the end, falls on ownership, because ownership has picked that personnel to lead the charge, and it's just not working.
Something struck me today, again, just watching people light their hair on fire because of the way that press conference went. I don't necessarily know what people were expecting. I mean, I get it.
Yeah.
Like asking for 2 more years. What's Jim supposed to say? No, we have to make the playoffs this year. Like, he knows that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But Jim Benning was hired because he's a so-called rink rat. He's a great scout, apparently.
Yeah.
And it was the personnel. Trevor Linden was supposed to be the public polished face to kind of be that buffer, because ownership refuses to talk to anyone unless it's on Twitter after a win. That's the only time we ever hear from ownership. And I will be clear, we have asked repeatedly to speak with the owner. The answer is always no. But here you have Jim trotted out in front of the cameras where he's going to be defensive. But at what point, and I know you're not selling tickets this year, at what point does this organization have to show some pride and just say, like, we're being laughed at here?
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know.
And I don't know if that's fair to Jim. You deal with him. You deal with him on a regular basis. He's never been a guy who's you can put in front of the Board of Trade and give this glowing, black backslapping, hilarious Brian Burke type speech.
Yeah.
That's not what he's good at. But it's like he comes out today and somehow we're not talking about this great game they played last night. Everyone's talking about how this team is a joke. And frankly, I don't know what else he could have said today.
Well, I think you kind of hit on, and I've talked a little bit about it. Like, this team doesn't have a president, doesn't have a CEO, hasn't had either of those positions in 2 years. And even, there are other teams that have a president and CEO. I'm not saying you have to have 2 people, but, there's no, and Trent Carroll is the COO, and, he, like everyone else, has taken on a whole bunch of extra stuff. And this goes on before COVID. And, so there, you can get these people to speak, but at the end of the day, Trevor Linden was hired to be, as much as anything, the public face of the new direction. And, you look at organizations beyond hockey, who ends up doing most of the talking? It's not often the person who's in the trenches. It's the person who's above it all, the person who's standing aside and saying, here's what we're doing. Here's what here's the explanation. And, like, at the end of the day, Jim Benning has signed up for this job, right? This is part of how it goes. Inevitably, you got to answer for what you're doing. But it is a reminder that there's no one else. Like, there's no one else to speak for what's going on. And there's no one really giving an explanation of what they're doing. And there's no one, this, in the end, it is Jim Benning's plan laid bare, such as it is. And I'm not saying necessarily, someone else is going to articulate his plan differently, but it comes back to sort of the idea of, how is our thinking being guided? Is it all falling on 1 or 2 people, or should it be falling on a group of people? That is generally
What's
been
your plan?
Right? Right. What's your plan? And so we see the plan. You're right. None of it's shocking. None of it really comes as a surprise.
But it's not savvy. We know Jim's not going to come out and put the pressure on himself, but to come out and say, I need 2 more years.
Yeah, and
how does he think that's going to go over?
Yeah, well, a certain level, at least he said it. I was sitting there as I was listening to the answer, going, oh my, he's not going to give us a number. And I kind of messaged Rob Williams, who asked the question. I said, Rob, like, try to press him on this. And then he came up and said, well, 2 years. And, I
I
mean,
love
at
this
the
media sharing questions via text with each other.
well, because this is how it
your
goes.
allotment's up.
But I mean, this is how it goes in Zoom, right? Like, this is the thing. I'd had my 2 questions. I was amazed that I put my hand back up, and I was amazed I was actually called on at the end to ask another question. But so kudos to the Canucks for that, because they're actually willing to come back to people. And I think Farhan got on at the end too. But no, I mean, I was kind of like, you're kind of like you are weirdly in the audience at a certain point in those situations, and so that's like, like let's get at it. But no, and yeah, 7 years in, you need 2 more years. Like, how is that a plan? That's not a plan. That's just like, well, we rolled the dice and didn't work out. I mean, it's like picking Jake Virtanen over Tyler Toffoli. Like, there was a way out of that scenario that sees them have Tyler Toffoli, who is clearly the better player, and helps you in whatever it is you're trying to do in both the short term and the long term. Versus taking I guess what I'm starting to think was a bet on Jake actually being able to work out, and it didn't. What a shock. And that
again, Patrick, 2 more years. Like, how many?
Yeah, maybe.
Make a decision.
Yeah.
Like, you get to a point, make a decision.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, the other people love. There's always this worry. Well, what if Jake turns into Cam Neely? One, he's not going to turn into Cam Neely. Let's talk more about who he's probably turned into, which is Jim Sandlak. You want to talk about Jim Sandlak?
They went down the Cam Neely road with Sandlak and held on too long. So,
you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's just one in the latest of a long series. I mean, here we are.
Pinizzotto was once the power forward hope too, as well. Right? So was Michael Furland.
I think that's hard on Steve Pinizzotto. That's unfair to Steve Pinizzotto. Anyway,
what was the other guy's name? Steve Man.
Anyway, but here we are.
And here we are. Endless names.
And it's endless, and it's just it's really tough to think about what's going to happen going forward.
Okay, well, we don't want to make this video endless, but
yes.
I do want to talk about the end of the season. So Virtanen did have a great game last night. They beat the Leafs. No one's talking about that today. Petey's injured. Where do you see the rest of the season playing out for the Canucks? And are Travis Green and or Jim Benning still here for next season?
I'm starting to think that Travis Green isn't going to be here next season. Not because he's going to be fired, but because he's going to choose to go somewhere else. I mean, I think he's in a position now where he's probably looked at what's going on and just been like, he's doing his best. I think I've been a defender of his. I think he's tried to do his best. I don't always agree with all the decisions he's made, but I think on the whole, he's tried to make his team play as well as he can, given what he's been presented with. But I think in his position, he's probably looking around at some of the opportunities. I mean, obviously, Calgary's probably not an opportunity anymore. But yeah, Seattle. I mean, there's going to be teams looking for coaches in the offseason, and he certainly is coaching for his reputation at this point. Jim Benning did say, yeah, we're going to have to play some more kids. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They have to see it, no matter who's in charge, they have to see what young players are ready to go. Good to see Mark Michaelis actually get in the lineup, because he's a guy that, he's a fourth liner realistically, but you need to figure out who those guys are going to be just as much as you have to figure out who your next Niels Holglander is. So I think there's going to be some element of that at some point, because they're so close to the sort of probability line of actually being a zero chance of making the playoffs, even if the math hasn't officially locked in. Very soon that's going to be a reality. And Jim Benning says, well, we're going to see how things are at the trade deadline. I mean, with COVID and quarantine rules, like, you just can't at this point. I mean, going to the US is currently now easier, partly because they are way further ahead in vaccinations, and that's just reality. But just in general, the quarantine rules are much less severe than they are coming north. So you can certainly ship players to the US with less challenge, I think, than vice versa. But if Jim's still looking for players that he can pluck into his lineup or drop into his lineup, he needs to start making trades now. I mean, trade deadline's a month away.
What is it with time? What is it with time with him? He told Kuz that he ran out of time on Tyler Toffoli. Now he's talking about, well, I need 2 more years.
Day to day.
And even some people ask him about the trade line. There's 5 weeks. Like, no concept of time here.
Well, and I think, but I mean, at the end, this is his plan, and he's not one who's going to blow it up. I think that's the reality too. And I think,
unless ownership was to say, you've got 5 more years, he can't blow this up.
Well, he can, and unless ownership says, yeah, it is time to blow it up. And if it's time to blow it up, they need to go a new direction. I mean, it is time to go. Let's be clear. It is time to blow it up, and it's clear what I'm saying. I think it's time for a new direction. They just haven't progressed enough in 7 years to really say, that there's anything that's going to change. It's like you look at the points percentage. They need to win two-thirds of the remaining games. Well, they've struggled to win 40% of their current games. So, like, are they really going to flip that around and all of a sudden become, twice as good? It's just the track record speaks for itself. And as much as I've enjoyed talking with Jim, I think it's time for a new direction.
Absolutely. Great stuff, Patrick. And again, I love the avocado shirt. You referenced Liverpool, not giving up on him yet. Got to kiss the badge. All right. We'll talk to you later.
Catch you later.